Local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
And welcome to the show, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Deidre Sinnott is our guest. Deidre is the author of a book just launched. It's a book about the abolitionist movement in Utica. The third Mr. Galloway. We're going to be talking to Deidre about the book. If you're interested in history, this is a novel, and there is a ton of local history in the book. But before we do that, we're going to say welcome. Good to see you.
Hi. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. The book is just out. Way back, you were up at the United County History Center talking about doing a book. When did you first get the idea, Deidre, of writing a book like this?
Really, it was around 2015. I had another project that kind of failed miserably.
A book project?
A book project, yeah. And I was talking to Kaylee Jones, who ultimately was the person who published the book, about what to do next. And I described the project of being Utica, Underground Railroad, and she's like, yes, write that one.
Okay.
And so I started in 2015 and handed it over to the publisher in 2019.
One of the things that just jumps out at you at this is the amount of research that had to be done to write this book. Do you recall the day you started your research?
Well, the way I got to the research was that I had been, I didn't ever learn that there was Underground Railroad activity in Utica, although I always imagined that there might be. And in 2007, I started looking through the index of books on the Underground Railroad and finally found a reference to the Utica Riot. And that was like a light went off. I wanted to know everything I could about it because I'd never heard of it before. It was a riot against the founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. And it broke up the meeting. They had to go to Peterborough to get it done the next day. And so I tried to learn everything I could about that. And I wanted to get it out further. I wanted maybe to do an opera about it or a musical or something. Yeah. And finally settled on the novel.
We're going to talk about the Utica riots in a little bit and about Peterborough. I guess we could have had that distinction that Peterborough has today. I had things going differently. But you're a product of the Utica school system, born here, and went to school here and then went on to Syracuse, were you telling me?
Yeah, after I graduated from Clinton Central School, I'd been in Utica schools. I went to Syracuse University and got a degree in theater, which I used for a while, and I still use sort of, but that was where I got, that was my undergraduate degree, and I have no further degrees.
Yeah. So you started your research. I know you did some research at now the United County History Center. Where else were you doing research for this?
Well, what's amazing, of course, is that there's a lot online, but there's also a lot that you're not going to find online. So I have been collecting and have a huge number of books, and luckily there are places that you can just find really helpful books for not a lot of money. And so if I was to create a bibliography about this, it would be, certainly 100 books at least. And looking, once you're in one book and you see a reference to another book, it's like, ooh, that sounds like an interesting book. In general, I've also taken some of my research down to Virginia. For instance, I wanted to know what a plantation would be like because there's two characters who have escaped from Virginia in the book. And I went and looked at the George Washington plantation, and they still had recreated probably cabins that the enslaved people lived in, and the Washington House and the Overseer's House.
We're talking Mount Vernon?
Yeah, Mount Vernon. And the Potomac goes right by there. So I decided to use that as the basis for the place where Amari, Joe, and Elimus come from.
History fiction, I think, has got some advantage. I've never tried to do that, but I mean, you can take some license and have some fun with it, but at the same time, you've got to be careful of your facts, because somebody said, well, that didn't happen in 1835, that happened in 1834.
And even knowing what kind of cooking technology somebody might be using, how a bread stove might work, how an cast iron stove works. Would somebody have that? It was when I started actually writing the book, some of the sentences you really had to struggle with, because you had to wait. I got to figure out, is there running water? No. They would have a dry sink. They would have a water pump. They would have a cistern. So all of those little details I wanted to get right, because if you get them wrong and somebody's reading it, they pop right out of the book and think that's wrong.
Well, yeah, not only that, but you question everything the writer says after that. You know, so well, if they got that wrong, what else are they getting wrong? We'll get into the thrust of the book in a second, but when you sat down to do the writing, what year was that?
That was 2015.
And how long did it take you to write it?
I did many drafts, so at least 7 to 10 drafts, and I handed it to the publisher in 2019, and that was done then.
And how do you write? Do you write with pen and paper, on a computer, what?
I use a computer, absolutely. And there's times when I want to write and I feel I haven't been able to approach it, so I fool myself into writing by saying, I'm just going to write a journal entry. And I'm not really going to write, but I'm going to think about this problem, and ultimately I'll write a little bit of a scene and take it out of the journal entry and put it right in the book.
Were you under a deadline to get this done, a self-imposed deadline or a publisher's deadline, any kind of a deadline?
With a first novel, it's hard to sell something like that and have a publisher's deadline. You have to have the whole thing pretty much together, and then the publisher has to fall in love with it and really want to do it. So I did not have an outside deadline. But for myself, I kept on with each draft saying, okay, I'd like this to be done by XYZ, you know, just to keep myself going.
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult. Well, I know it's very difficult for me to write without a deadline. If I don't have a deadline, I suddenly find things to do during the day. Are you a disciplined writer?
I don't think so, but since I loved it so much, I kept going back to it. The project that I gave up, if I had gotten notes from somebody, oh, I didn't want to go back and rewrite it. But with this one, notes were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let me go back. And I could tell by my enthusiasm that I was approaching it in a different way. When
I started writing, I started on a manual typewriter. I can't imagine using a manual typewriter today and going back and editing and changing and switching paragraphs. Can you?
Well, like my husband reads a lot of Trollope to me, and it feels like, yeah, they did maybe 1-2 drafts and then they're done.
Yeah.
And Trollope is wonderful, I love him, but there's some things there that if it had been now, they would have been editing that a little bit more because they had the luxury of being able to do it.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk to Deidre about the third Mrs. Galloway and the thrust of the book. It's a very interesting novel. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody, and thanks for sticking with us. Our guest is Deidre Sinnott. We're talking about her new book, The Third Mrs. Galloway. We're going to ask her how that title came to be and where that picture is from. But before I ask you that, Deidre, Sinnott, that's a pretty prominent name around here. Are you related to the Sinnotts of the Bank of Utica?
Yes, my grandfather, John Sinnott, founded the Bank of Utica, and my father worked there for decades. John Sinnott also. Roger Sinnott, who passed away not so long ago.
Not so long ago, yeah.
He was my uncle, and Tom is my cousin, and Barry is my first cousin once removed.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that we have this big chunk of history here. The Bank of Utica was the major sponsor of this year's telethon for the United County History Center. The title, The Third Mrs. Galloway, where did that come from?
Well, the title was a process, and I think it's hard to find the right title sometimes. When I started writing the book, I was calling it The Society. Because the anti-abolition riot was at the center of it, I kind of wanted to get in all those levels of society that might have gone and participated, from the upper echelons, Samuel Beardsley and Judge Chester Hayden, all the way down to the people who were at the grog houses all night long before the disruption. Then I found out that Halley's Comet had been passing over right in October 1835. And that was very fascinating to me. There was reports that they had seen Halley's Comet. And so I decided, well, let's call it the comet, because comets were these they brought change. They were feared. It was something that, was disruptive. That didn't go over very well with my mentor, Kaylee, and other people. So I did a whole list of potential titles. And somehow the third Mrs. Galway just drew people in, because it's like a question. If she's the third, who's the first? Who's the second? What happened before? I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh, I thought there was going to be 3. This is the third book, the third Mrs. Galway." I said, "Well, no. Augustine Galway is not like Bluebeard. He doesn't have, like these women he's been killing. But the third Mrs. Galway just seemed to be the right title, and I'm really happy that it came that way."
I was writing something about Walter D. Edmonds the other day in his classic Drums Along the Mohawk, but that wasn't the original title. The original title was the Starving Wilderness.
Oh.
That just doesn't do anything for you, does it? And the publisher didn't like that, and the publisher wanted Drums on the Mohawk, and then the publisher, Walter D. Edmonds, settled on Drums Along the Mohawk. You can't imagine anything but that, but anyway. The picture, where does the picture come from?
Both pictures are unidentified women in the Library of Congress's collection, and we were going through trying to find some images that really seemed like this could have been one of our characters. When the artists put them together and put them in the field and put the advertisement for Runaway in there, it just looked so wonderful. I'm thrilled.
It works,
totally
doesn't
thrilled
it?
with it. Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning of the book. It starts with it would be 1830.
It's all 1835.
35. And some people are trying to get away from slavery. And take it from there, how it starts. They find a little place to have refuge for that night, a stormy night.
Right, they're walking from Frankfurt along the Erie Canal, and I used the Erie Canal a number of times. For me to think about the Erie Canal just right there in the center of town was really fascinating. So when they get to Utica, they split off and are in the middle of a terrible storm and looking for a place to hide and a place to be dry. And the mother is quite pregnant, and the son is about 10, and he's miserable. And so they go into a shed and think they're safe there, but by the end of the chapter, somebody's already discovered them, and that would be Helen.
And in your mind, where do you picture this shed today? Where would it be?
It's right where Oskanitz is.
Okay.
Exactly right there.
All right.
Yeah, the Galway house is on 3rd and Bleecker, and the shed is behind there. And then the Ballou Creek was running right by there.
You know, I was very interested to see Ballou Creek in the book because it's a creek that back in the day was very prominent in Utica, but today it runs underground, so nobody even knows it's there. And of course, I went to Camp Ballou, the Boy Scout camp, which so I've always been fascinated by that Ballou Creek. So they got into the shed and got refuge for the night, and that's where the drama begins. Yes.
Right. They're found by Helen Galway, who is just married. Her husband is a prominent man who is part of the American Colonization Society, and the Colonization Society was something that I didn't know much about, but had to learn about in order to get the book done. The Colonization Society was trying to solve slavery by sending free people of color and people who've been released from slavery to Liberia, which is in Africa. And at the time, that colony already existed. It was being paid for and having its own troubles. So she's got to decide what to do. She's, you know, should she trust her husband?
And he wasn't the most reputable guy.
Well, he has some drinking problem. Yeah. He's broken his leg falling off his horse.
Drunk.
Yeah. And so she, instead of turning them over to the police, she just decides to wait it out and see, maybe they'll just go away. Maybe they'll just disappear. You know, like if you ignore a problem long enough, it'll go away. Yeah. But it doesn't work out.
This one didn't go away.
Yeah.
We're talking with Deidre Sinnott. We're talking about her book, The Third Mrs. Galway. It's just out. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Deidre Sinnott is our guest. She is the author of The Third Mrs. Galway, and it's $17.95. It's on sale now up at the United County History Center, where much of the research for the book was done by Deidre. 1835, there's a map in the book of Utica in 1835. Everything was pushed down, so to speak, from where it is today. And I believe, you tell me if I'm wrong, I believe that one of those buildings that was involved with the riots is still standing down there.
Right, at the block where Utica Coffee is.
Yeah.
That whole block on Genesee Street on the west side, just north of Riscony Boulevard. If you look up at the building that forms the corner, if you look up, you'll see 1833 on a plate there. Mm-hmm. And that was Alvin Stewart's office.
He was an attorney.
He was an abolitionist attorney, came from Cherry Valley, lived in Utica, died in 1849, so he didn't get to see freedom come. Mm-hmm. And then if you proceed a little bit further down, there's a building there that is being called the Hayden Building. I believe it's going to be condominiums. And that is where Judge Chester Hayden had his office and also occasionally held hearings and whatnot.
So we had two, I don't want to use the word warring, but we had two factions here. We had the people who were in favor of the abolitionist movement, and then we had the people on the other side. Why Utica? What made Utica such a hotbed for this?
It's in part because of the arrival of Beriah Green, who was the professor. He was a reverend and a professor. He came from Western Reserve College in Ohio, and he was working at the Oneida Institute in Whitesboro. Mm-hmm. And he was a fiery abolitionist. And so anyone who had abolitionist leanings or concern for enslaved people, he became a catalyst to make it more political, more involved. He and Alvin Stewart were at the founding meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. And so they were developing into sort of nationally known figures within the abolition movement. And so when they got back to Utica, they said, hey, let's form a statewide, in conjunction with those who they'd met, the Tappins and Garrison in Philadelphia. They said, let's form a statewide anti-slavery society. So from Utica, all these organizers and speakers fanned out. They had a book depository here where people could get supplies to go on these speaking tours. So it really was the center of abolition organizing in upstate New York. And they really did a lot of it. They had agents they were paying who were going out to all the little towns and sometimes being attacked and sometimes being welcomed. And I'd say that there were abolitionists, there were colonizationists, there were people who were, very prejudiced, but also there's the mass of people who just didn't care or didn't have time to care about what was going on in the South. It felt very far away. So I was both astonished at the amount of discussion there was about slavery in the Utica newspapers at that time, but also just that most people didn't affect them, so they didn't think about it.
How bad was the Utica riot?
There's different opinions about it. I think that anything like a riot like that is beyond the control of the people who start setting it off. So while it was, they were vilifying the abolitionists in the paper, so they were gathering a lot of momentum of people who weren't necessarily there for a political purpose in the same way that the Beardsley and the others were there for a political purpose to redeem Utica from what they felt was a smudge of being an abolition town. And so things got out of control. Like the Committee of 25, which was the gentlemen of property and standing, just wanted to disrupt it. But then there was all these others who flooded in, and there was fisticuffs and barking dogs and a struggle. And then also when people were leaving, they were pelted with mud, they were pelted with stones and eggs. And even as they made their way to Peterborough, they were still being attacked. Somebody practically got a concussion, and his group had to shelter with the Brothertown Indians, who allowed them to stay and be safe. So it really rippled out.
Why Peterborough? Why did they go to Peterborough?
Well, Garrett Smith, who was born in Utica, who's a very wealthy man, lived in Peterborough. He came to the founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society mostly out of curiosity. He was a colonizationist, put his money where his mouth was, really supported them. But he was really upset at the abrogation of the right to assemble and the right to free speech. And so he said, come to Peterborough, there you'll be protected, you can have your meeting. And he was converted by the experience of the riot as well.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but the Underground Railroad, Utica was a stop. There's still places in Utica still standing that were havens, yes?
Yeah, there are, and they're throughout Oneida County. It's really a major thing here, and we're uncovering that as well.
Are you doing a project with that?
Yes, with the Fort Stanwix Underground Railroad project, and there'll be a report in 2022. We found over 70 places in Oneida County.
Still standing?
Not all still standing.
Yeah.
Rome, Utica, there's been lots of changes.
Yeah, but there are still some that are standing, yes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Congratulations on the book.
Well, thank
It's a good read for anybody that wants to pick it up. Oneida County History Center. It's on sale there now. Maybe come back and talk about your other project, huh?
Yeah, I'd love that.
Okay, good. So would I. That's going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget cnyhomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.